Today, the bikie accused of being involved in Lisa Goven's disappearance broke his silence, with Club Dero's Andrew Edhouse appearing as the final witness at the inquest. Lisa's family watched on in court.
I'm not giving up hope. I'm not giving up on Lisa at all. We always hope that we'll get some result in the end, somehow, somewhere.
Somebody thinks they've got away with murder.
Police think Lisa Goven is dead.
We all love you very, very much.
It was the Wild West.
There was bad people and really bad people.
Do you know how Lisa Goven died?
Yes, I do.
Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. So after a 5-month adjournment, the one witness we wondered if we would ever hear from appeared at the inquest via video link, one Andrew Wayne Edhouse. Now, we have an image of Edhouse in our minds. He is the baby-faced bikie in flannels. That's how we remember him, because he's not the sort of person you see in the media very often. It was quite bizarre to me to see him on screen today.
Particularly where he was coming from. He was coming into court via video link remotely from some location. We weren't told where he was actually broadcasting from, but he was sitting under a tin roof. There was a fan in the background. He was dressed in some kind of work club. It looked like a hard yakka or something that. It was like a long sleeve collared shirt. He's obviously a lot older than any of the photos that we have from back in the early 2000s. He'd be in his 50s now, wearing glasses. He's got a little goatee beard, which is obviously what every bikie has got to have. He's no longer got a baby face. That's pretty clear. He pretty much looks like an older bikie.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, we knew what we were going to get.
And it was actually the fact that he was video link, it was quite frustrating because they did start with a lot of technical difficulties. The link kept falling out and we'd lose his audio and we'd lose his vision. And at one point he says, it's shit itself again, fuck's sake. And he had to be reminded that we're in an open court and everyone can hear.
Well, it proved that even bikies have IT problems. So we had a situation where the court was telling him to turn it off and turn it back on several times. And it was frustrating because we couldn't really see what was going on for a little while there. But I was actually quite happy he wasn't in court, to be honest, because I thought it would be so confronting for him to rock up and see Lisa's family who was sitting there. I was very glad for their sake that it was done via video link. We did get the connection going eventually. And, this was quite an extraordinary experience. You don't hear or see from bikies like Andrew Wayne Edhouse terribly often. This guy is the real deal. He is one of the most feared people in the Australian underworld. I know seasoned bikies who go to water when you even mention his name. He has a reputation for being incredibly ruthless.
Well, we're going to run through the evidence from Andrew Edhouse today. And we'll talk about it in the way it was delivered and the order in which it was delivered. And you can decide for yourself how forthcoming Edhouse was, because during this inquest, there has been a lot of talk about the bikie code of silence. Now, of course, the coroner, Michael Jenkin, and counsel assisting Sue Markham put to him some of the horrific evidence that we'd heard from witnesses during the course of the inquest, including that Andrew Edhouse had jumped on Lisa Goven's head as she lay on the floor of his clubhouse.
And the family had to relive all these moments. It was quite confronting, of course. We also found out for the first time definitively why Andrew Edhouse has the nickname Crowie. I actually, honestly, thought it had something to do with birds. That's apparently not that. That's how naive I am. The police lawyer who was appearing at the inquest asked him how he got his nickname, and he said he couldn't remember, and she put to him, "Is it because you break people's legs with crowbars?" And Edhouse laughs and says, "Look, I'm sorry for laughing, but that's not the case at all." And he says, "No, I really don't recall breaking people's legs with a crowbar." But it was an interesting insight into a man that has been writ large on headlines about crime stories for the best part of 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like sitting there, it felt like insider information. That's the kind of thing, we wouldn't ordinarily hear, despite the fact that he says, well, that's ridiculous. That's not why I'm called that. So Sue Markham started by asking if he knew Lisa Goven back in Kalgoorlie in 1999. And he says, oh, yeah, I would have seen her around. I wouldn't have known her name at that stage. But he does agree that, yep, they had met, they'd spoken because they drink at the same bars.
This is an enduring theme in testimony where everyone says, well, we kind of saw each other. You'd know them by sight, but you wouldn't know their names because Kalgoorlie was a pretty small town in the late 1990s and everyone was drinking together.
It's impossible not to run into people in the bars. So she also questioned him about his knowledge of this inquest, which, as we know, started in November 2024, because we heard earlier that Andrew Edhouse had spoken to Mick Heaton, who was a witness. Now, you'll recall from previous episodes, Mick Heaton was the bloke referred to as the muscle, the bloke that the Deros would call on to fix problems. So Edhouse says, well, yeah, I did speak to him the night before his evidence. He might have called me, I might have called him, I'm not sure which it was. And he said, but he spoke to me about what had already been said in court, kind of like caught him up, not what he was going to say in evidence the next day.
He was trying to make the point that he hadn't colluded with or influenced Mick Heaton's evidence. I've got to be honest, I don't think anyone could convince Mick Heaton to do anything that Mick Heaton didn't want to do. This guy, I think we said previously, has all the warmth of a great white shark.
And Edhouse said that himself. No one tells Mick Heaton what to do.
They then talked about where Mick Heaton sat in the pantheon of Club Dero hierarchy, and it was suggested that Mick Heaton was an enforcer. If there was a problem, he could get the job done, bit of a fixer. And Andrew said, no, that's not the case. He's never done anything for me. I don't know what you mean. That's just a bit ridiculous.
Okay, so then what happens is Sue Markham runs through the other key witnesses and the timeline of everything that we'd heard in court up to this date. And she asks him on each point if he can recall any of these things. So, spoiler alert, he actually says he can't recall much of anything.
Shocking.
So, for example, she says, Lisa was seen going back into the clubhouse. Do you remember that? And he says, no, I wasn't aware of that. And he says, oh, my memory wasn't that good. And to him, it was just another night. So Sue Markham says to him, but surely this event is different to just another night on the piss. Wouldn't it be seared into your memory given Lisa was missing days later and 6 days after that, your clubhouse was searched by police? And he says, well, if I was involved, sure, it would be a night to remember, but I wasn't.
It was kind of like watching two people who were boxing in the ring. They were sort of sparring and trying to work out each other's weak points. He confirmed he lived at the clubhouse with Trevor Atkinson. He's an associate who we've heard in evidence was with Edhouse the morning of Lisa's disappearance. Trevor wasn't a patched member of the Deros. Edhouse went to great pains to say he's not an associate. I just call him a friend. He said that's what I just called him a mate, a friend. And he downplayed Trevor's role at the club, saying that he or Trevor didn't have any higher authority or what happened in the clubhouse than anyone else. We'd previously heard that Trevor was like a barman. He had the keys to the bar. He pretty much did any odd job, and we felt that it was like he was currying favour because he wanted to become a patched member. And Sue Markham put to Andrew Edhouse that he could basically get ordered around a little bit, and Andrew said, and I thought this was quite telling, he said, no, I don't think that's right. He said, no, I don't think anyone could tell him what to do. So this idea that Trevor Atkinson was some kind of a hapless idiot that was just bumbling around, I think there's a little bit more to Trevor's story that we don't know.
Yeah, and she was making the point that he would do what you told him to because he wanted to be a member. And Edhouse said, no, that's not right. So then she asks him about another witness we'd heard from, which is Kevin Smith. Now, Kevin Smith was a guy who was the drug dealer in Kalgoorlie. He was an associate, not a patched member. And she asks Edhouse if he remembers buying drugs from Kevin, and he says no. But he does say, yeah, I use drugs occasionally, and his drug of choice.
This was like watching a headmaster or a headmistress kind of interview a teenage school student about, well, you've been busted, come clean. And he said, oh, a little bit of ecstasy, maybe a bit of speed. No, I'm not so much on the cocaine, though.
Not so much on the cocaine. And it's important that because in previous evidence we heard that Trevor Atkinson had called this Kevin Smith to deliver cocaine to the clubhouse the morning Lisa Govan disappeared. But Edhouse says to that, I have no recollection of that at all. And also, I wouldn't have had cocaine.
Next name we had was John Hope. This is Little John. Bikies do love their nicknames, as we know. Little John was a patched member. It's around this time that Sue Markham, the counsel assisting the coroner, started grilling Andrew Edhouse about the Bikie Code of Silence. Now, this was a really interesting exchange. I actually felt that he was being quite truthful when he was speaking about this. He talked about he obviously didn't like the phrase.
No.
But he said, look, I don't talk to police. And then he said, but that's not because of a Bikie Code of Silence. It's because I don't talk to anyone who tries to screw over me, my family, and my friends. He said, it's nothing to do with the code. That's just my view. And he said then that there were many reasons that he hated cops. And this is one of the more interesting parts of today's testimony. He said that the police had tried to convince his son that he was going to kill him. Edhouse was going to kill his own son. And he also said that police had kidnapped and beaten up many of his friends.
Yeah, he was pretty, I don't know if I'd say angry.
Was seeing the animosity between bikies and police in real time. You could just see this seething frustration about how the police had a bit more power in the relationship and could do these things.
Sue Markham kept pressing him on this because she really wanted to nail down this idea of this code of silence. So she eventually gets him to agree that the code of silence would mean for members, now not necessarily associates, but for members, that you don't talk about club business with anyone who isn't associated with the club. And he then says, okay, yes, that's right.
And then she says, well, that must extend to your associates, not speaking to police, for fear of retribution from the club. And he says, well, I wouldn't be happy about that if you found out someone had been speaking to the cops. And she says, well, what would you do? And he says, I wouldn't be happy about that, and nor would other people. It was actually quite sinister.
Yes, and it was almost left hanging about this idea, well, okay, does that mean you would wrap a crowbar around someone's knees?
Yeah, that was the very obvious subtext that wasn't said but was hanging in the air.
It was hanging there.
Sue Markham then goes through that night at the Safari Club and reveals they had looked through the footage the day prior to his appearance. So he appears on Thursday, and they don't explicitly say it, but just through hints, we pick up the fact that, hang on, he's not coming in cold here.
Yeah.
They've talked before, because she keeps talking about stuff that they talked about yesterday.
And we looked at each other because, I don't know, to me that seemed unusual, but I guess we said, well, perhaps that's a technical issue, that he's on a video link. They can't play the video to him while he's on a video link.
They obviously wanted to play him the CCTV that purports to show him and Lisa outside the Safari nightclub about 4:30 in the morning on October 8 in 1999. With regards to that, I mean, it's quite obviously Andrew Edhouse when you see pictures of him in 1999 in the press and then footage of him in the CCTV. But he seemed pretty confused
not according
about
to Andrew
that.
Edhouse.
He said, look, everyone says it's me, but I can't recall that that's me. I'm just saying everyone might say it's me, but it could be me, but I'm not sure if it's actually me.
Yeah. It was, I don't know, it was strange. But eventually the coroner says to him, Michael Jenkins says, okay, so you don't say it wasn't you just can't remember that it's you. And he says, correct. He also says he can't recall the moment when we heard about Trevor. Of course, in that vision, you'll remember we talked about it, that we see Trevor come aggressively at Lisa, and Andrew Edhouse puts up like a protective hand to stop him. And Trevor was questioned about that, which we spoke about, and he said, I wouldn't have meant to hurt her. And
well, they hammered Trevor on that when he was giving testimony, asking, well, it looks like you kind of hit her. And he said, no, I kind of pushed her away. But either way, on the footage, it does look like Edhouse has moved in to try and protect her. This is all important because the footage also shows Edhouse kissing Lisa.
That's right.
And it shows that they had some kind of a sexual chemistry, something was happening. That's important because it feeds into what happened perhaps at the club, the Darrow's clubhouse, a few hours later. Edhouse says he can't specifically recall going to the clubhouse or who was there with them on that morning. We've previously heard from people including Cecily Richards, Ben the DJ, Paddy, who was one of the bouncers. he said all these names are rattled off by Sue Markham, and Ed House said, no, I don't really recall any of these names. I don't know any of them. Maybe I knew some of their nicknames, but nothing's ringing a bell. He couldn't remember smashing a stubby on the bar and cutting himself quite badly, which several witnesses had said had happened. He doesn't remember flirting with Lisa, doesn't really recall playing pool with her, even though we heard multiple witnesses describing the events of that morning. Ed House says, no, I can't recall any of it.
And the coroner then says to him, okay, well, we have multiple witnesses who saw this stuff that you're saying you can't recall. So can I rely on the evidence of other witnesses about what they say they saw? Is that fair? And he says, yeah, but I don't recall it. And, of course, no amount of pressing about, well, surely this stuff would stick in your mind changes his evidence that he has no recollection.
This is all leading up to a very important point on October 8 of that year. And this is when Kevin Smith pulls up. This is Kevin Smith, the drug dealer from Kalgoorlie, pulls up with a bloke called Ross Edwards, who was his tradie labourer. And they came up to the clubhouse not once, not twice, but thrice on October 8. The first time they came there for no really good reason, as I recall. The second time they were going to drop some cocaine. And the third time they came to pick up a staple gun. Now, Andrew didn't deny any of these trips, but he said, I can't recall any of these interactions. The importance of this is Kevin Smith and Ross Edwards had described seeing Lisa standing outside the Foundry Hotel the first time they came. That was right next door to the clubhouse. The second time they came, we had evidence she was standing by the gate with Ed House and Atkinson, the gate to the clubhouse. And the third time, importantly, the trio were no longer outside, and there was a suggestion they'd moved into the clubhouse by this stage.
That's right. And this is the crux of what happened after what they're saying is the last credible sighting of Lisa at 7 a.m. going back into the clubhouse with Ed House. Now, he again says, I have no memory. And Sue Markham again says to him, but given that she disappeared days later, you must have a memory. And he says, nope, none at all. And he says, because from my point of view, nothing eventful happened worth remembering. Of course, that must have been
very hard to hear from the Govan family who were there watching this man say that on video screen. And you could tell the strain on their faces when they heard this person say, look, nothing happened worth remembering.
There was nothing worth remembering that day or night.
Ross Smith said he was having a smoke off to the side of the clubhouse while Kevin spoke to Ed House at the door of the clubhouse. They were speaking through a metal gate. There was kind of a barricade there. And that Ed House disappeared and came back with the staple gun, which he passed through the mesh of the door and then disappeared and comes back to the front door again. And you might remember that in a statement to police, Ross Edwards said Kevin Smith later revealed to him in the car when they were driving away from the clubhouse that he had seen Crowe run inside and jump on a woman's head inside the clubhouse, and that she wasn't looking in a good way, she wasn't moving, and that Trevor Atkinson was sitting at the bar. That there is the nub of the case against the Club Deros pertaining to Lisa Govan.
And to that, Ed House says, that's something I would have remembered, and it didn't happen. It's one thing to ask if I remember someone at a nightclub or whether I jumped on some Sheila's head. I did not. I'm saying I did not jump on someone's head. And he obviously wanted to clarify and say, you know, I don't remember a single thing from that night, but if I'd done something like that, I would remember.
Sue Markham then ran through a bunch of alternate scenarios. Was there an argument, she said? Did you and Lisa have some kind of a falling out? Did Lisa overdose on cocaine? Is that how she ended up on the floor? And that's where Ed House kind of perked up at that. He said, who said she overdosed? Who suggested that? He said, that's the first I've heard of that. If someone had overdosed, I would have for sure known about it.
And she broadens her questions and she says, well, did you hurt her in any way? Did she leave the clubhouse of her own free will? And he says, well, I don't even recall her being there. So again, Sue Markham gets her back up again at this, and again she gets frustrated. And she says, well, you know, you can see why people are confused, right? Something this significant happens, police search a property. You know, 100 years later, I would remember that. And he says, well, lucky if you make it to 100. And she goes quite quiet, and they have this moment where they stare at each other, and he says something like, well, you know, how's anyone going to make it to 100? I mean, that's lucky.
It was like a sideshow that he was sort of distracting, trying to distract Sue a little bit. It was quite an awkward moment, to be honest.
It was awkward.
Sue Markham and Michael Jenkin, the coroner, then kind of tag-teamed Andrew on the matter of what he had told other people and spoken to other people regarding Lisa's disappearance. And he maintained that he never spoke to anyone at any point. And there was this exchange that was really quite sort of bizarre. Like, I know that the coroner was certainly trying to get his head around this. He said to Ed House, can you accept that it's very difficult to believe that you haven't spoken to Mr. Atkinson or Mr. Smith about Lisa's disappearance, even though all three of you have been arrested by police on suspicion of her murder or being an accessory after the fact? And Ed House says there was nothing to discuss as far as I was concerned. And then the coroner says, you didn't speak to Mr. Atkinson after you were released by police because, of course, they were all released without charge. Ed House says, no. And the coroner says, really? And Ed House says, why would I? And then the coroner says, because you were the last two people to see Lisa alive. Your evidence to me is that from October 8, 1999 until today, you've not spoken to Mr. Atkinson or Mr. Smith about her disappearance and suspected murder. He was absolutely apoplectic that he was maintaining this position that he'd never spoken about an incident that was the talk of the town in Kalgoorlie in 1999 and through to 2000, 2001, 2002.
And Sue Markham says, well, what about even something like, oh, that chick the other night, what happened to her, do you think? And Andrew Edhouse said, oh, well, yeah, we could have been a conversation, but I actually can't recall any conversation. So she then says again, well, so did Lisa leave the clubhouse alive? And then he says, well, I reckon she would have, or I would have known about it.
Well, then, by this stage, the counsel assisting and the coroner were quite visibly frustrated with the way things were going. So they moved on, and Sue Markham started asking him about the square of carpet that had been removed from the area where Lisa's body, we were told, had been lying near the pool table. Now, this is a square of carpet that had just disappeared. By the time the cops went in 6 days later, it was a conspicuous absence in the middle of the room, never been recovered. The police had drilled into the concrete underneath where that square was in the hope that they could find some DNA evidence about what had gone on, but nothing came of that. She asked him why it had been removed, who asked for that to happen, who did it and why, and he says something like, well, maybe there were renovations or something. They may have been continuing. And Sue says, I'm suggesting the carpet was removed and the floor underneath it was painted to clean up forensic evidence. And he says, I would have to disagree with that.
Yeah, and then the police lawyer wanted to ask a couple of questions, and she honed in on this Land Cruiser ute, which we have heard previously that police speculate was used to remove Lisa's body. And, you know, she asks Ed House, did you ask anyone to bring the ute? Did you ask anyone to take the ute away? It went away for a couple of hours. And then she went on to ask about the two detectives who rocked up the morning of Lisa Govan's disappearance.
This was very interesting, if only for the fact that it was the police lawyer who brought up the fact that there were two cops outside the Club Darrow's clubhouse the morning Lisa Govan vanished. And those two police officers, Doug Steppich and Kevin Riley, were having a discussion with the Darrows outside the clubhouse, we've been told. The police lawyer drilled into that, wanting to know what the meeting was about. And Ed House was, look, he was a little bit trying to be half pregnant with this. On the one hand, he was saying, I don't recall having a meeting out the front of the Darrows, but then he said, but if it wasn't a meeting, it was more a conversation kind of thing. But either way, I don't think it happened. I can't recall it happening.
It was about the semantics here because he sort of said, well, we would never have a meeting out the front of the clubhouse.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm out the front of the clubhouse and I'm talking to people, then I'm just having a conversation with friends, even though he didn't recall this conversation.
Yes, the thing that he didn't recall happened in a different way is what he was trying to argue. So the police lawyer then went back to Ed House and started talking about his relationship with Lisa inside the clubhouse and asked point blank, did you have sex that night? And he says, I don't think so. I think I would remember that. I don't recall, but should say it's possible, but I don't think so.
That's right. And so then the coroner says to him, you know, what I want to know, Mr. Ed House, is what happened to Lisa after all of this. And he says, well, I can't tell you what I don't know. So the coroner says to him, well, did she walk off? Because that's what Trevor Atkinson told us during his evidence. He says she must have walked off, but you don't even go that far. To which Ed House says, well, I'm saying I can't recall, and I'm not really sure what you're asking. I can't recall what I don't recall. So the coroner says, is it because you had something to do with her death? And he says, no, definitely not at all.
One of the final scenes we saw play out in the inquest was the coroner telling Andrew Ed House, the man accused of stomping on Lisa Govan's head and killing her, that Lisa's family was in the courtroom and listening to him. And the coroner was looking at the family when he was speaking to Andrew Ed House, and he said, is there anything you can tell them about what happened to their family member after being seen with you on the 8th of October of 1999? And Andrew Ed House said, unfortunately, I cannot.
And that was basically the end of Andrew Ed House's evidence. And the coroner then went on to explain, you know, what he does next, that he would go through the documents and the statements. There were statements from 44 people, 11 witnesses, and he said he had 500 pages of transcripts. And he said he'd make a conclusion in writing as soon as he could. And he gave a bit of a, I don't know if warning's the right word, but he basically said, you know, in making a finding about the circumstances of Lisa's disappearance, it was going to be very difficult and would likely be an open finding. And that basically means that, look, maybe Lisa was murdered, maybe Lisa was assaulted, maybe Lisa died of natural causes, because every one of those options has to remain open in the absence of hard evidence.
And this goes to the very heart of why we have coronial inquiries. It's actually to issue a death certificate as much as anything else. With a missing person like Lisa, in the eyes of the law, she's still alive. So someone needs to actually draw a line under this and say, no, we are happy to conclude that Lisa Govan is dead. And in doing that, it has to be a very confronting process because they need to chase every rabbit down every burrow, and some of those rabbits are pretty ugly.
Yeah.
The coroner then spoke directly to Lisa's family and he was eyeballing Pat and Ian, her mother and father. And he made the point that they had shown great courage and perseverance. And he said, on behalf of the court, I offer my sincere condolences for your terrible loss.
And that was really a very difficult moment for them. And they said to us later that for them that was almost the point when the dam burst, because they had sat through this sometimes terrible evidence, listening to people speak about their daughter, their sister, and this acknowledgement of this is not just a person that's being spoken about, but the person that they loved, the person that mattered to them. And so for them, it was this humanising of this process and incredibly sad. And, you know, I had a tear myself because I just at that point felt like this was such a mountain for them to climb, and you'd have to be a really hard bugger not to have a lump in your throat.
This was the family's Everest, and they'd spent 26 years trying to get to the summit, and when they got there was nothing to see.
Yeah. So that's really where we got to for today, and basically what happens now, the coroner goes away, he will write up those findings and he will hand them down, and it is a waiting game again for the Govans who will be waiting for that. Until then, you can catch up on all of the stories online at thewest.com.au, where you'll also find the documentary series that we did back in 2020. That's Catching Lisa's Killer, Fear and Murder in Kalgoorlie, if you haven't seen that and you would like to see that one. So from Ben and I, we will be back with you when the coroner does hand down those findings.